When Douglas Cook's son reduced him to a burden after 40 years of sacrifice, they expected him to fade quietly into irrelevance. But underestimated, humiliated, and dismissed, Douglas turned the betrayal into a masterclass in strategic revenge, teaching his family, his company, and the world that underestimating a patient man is the deadliest mistake of all. During the first week of my retirement, my son Christopher told me, "We don't need another mouth to feed in this house," and found me a job as a cleaner. I smiled and agreed, hiding my cold anger behind a mask of resignation. But when I didn't show up for work, he realized something. He had underestimated me, and now his life would never be the same again. Today was my last day at work. I arrived home, expecting congratulations, maybe even a toast with the cheap wine we save for special occasions. But instead, silence stretched across our small kitchen table like a chasm. Christopher's fork slipped from his hand, clattering against his plate. Lily's eyes widened in shock. I beamed at them both, anticipating smiles, but what I received was a wall of disbelief. Christopher's face flushed red. "What? Dad, you can't just quit your job like that. Did you even think about what this means?" "Of course I did," I said, my smile wavering. 40 years of service, son. I've earned this. I thought we could celebrate." "Celebrate?" Lily's voice cut through the air. "Chris, your father thinks we're going to feed him for free." The warmth in my chest began to freeze. This wasn't how I'd imagined this moment. Instead of pride, Christopher's face contorted with annoyance. "Listen, Dad," he said, his manager's tone replacing any trace of affection. "I'm not keeping an extra mouth to feed. You need a job tomorrow. I don't care if it's flipping burgers or stocking shelves, but you're not sitting around here living off my paycheck." Each word hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the man I'd raised, whose education and wedding I'd paid for, now lecture me about freeloading. Lily nodded in agreement. "Douglas, you're 65, not 90. Plenty of people your age work. My neighbor's father bags groceries until he's 73. But I began. "You thought wrong," Christopher interrupted. "Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain this house? To keep you fed and clothed? I worked 50 hours a week at Whitmore Industries just to keep us afloat." The irony wasn't lost on me. They would understand soon enough. My untouched dinner grew cold as I absorbed their words. The meatloaf, my favorite, now looked unappetizing under the harsh light. Everything about this moment felt wrong, as if I were viewing my life through a distorted mirror. "You're right," I said quietly. "I should have discussed it with you first." Christopher's expression softened slightly. "Look, Dad, I'm not trying to be cruel, but reality is reality. We can't afford a freeloader. Dependent." The word buzzed in my head as I nodded. "I said I would think about your words." "Good," Lily said, gathering the plates. "The sooner, the better." They disappeared into the living room, leaving me alone. I could hear the television spring to life, their voices returning to normal, as if they hadn't just shattered 40 years of dreams in 10 minutes. I remained seated, staring at the empty chairs. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs. Slowly, I stood and began clearing the remaining dishes, my hands moving automatically while my mind processed what had just occurred. They saw me as a burden. After everything I had done, they viewed me as an unwanted expense. I turned off the kitchen light and headed to my small bedroom at the back of the house. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, but tonight I needed to think. I lay fully clothed on my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The shadows from passing cars painted moving patterns across the walls. My mind churned with the dinner conversation. 40 years of faithful service, and this was my reward. My bedroom was small, furnished with just the basics. Family photos lined the dresser top. Christopher's graduation, his wedding, and holidays were all happy times. Had that been an illusion? Voices drifted through the thin wall. Can't believe he just announced it like that, Christopher was saying. He thinks he can just sit at home on my dime. 40 years of work. So what? That doesn't entitle him to retirement on my salary. Lily's response was muffled but distinct. What if he refuses to work? What if he just sits around all day? Then we'll take his pension and put him in a nursing home, Christopher said, his voice sharp with finality. I'm tired of supporting dead weight. The words hit me like ice water. Nursing home. Dead weight. I gripped the bedsheet, my knuckles white. Lily continued. He's been mooching off us since Mom died. Free meals. And now he doesn't even want to work. Maybe we should give him a deadline, Lily suggested. 1 week to find work or he's out. Perfect, Christopher said. And if he complains, we'll remind him that beggars can't be choosers. Their laughter drifted through the wall, casual and cruel. I lay there, absorbing every word. These were the people I'd sacrificed for. The house grew quiet again. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose fears I'd soothed, viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient expense. A nursing home, take my pension, warehouse me with other discarded parents. I thought about my colleagues who'd received gold watches and retirement parties. Jim Morrison got a fishing boat from his kids. Helen's family threw her a surprise celebration at the country club. I got threats and ultimatums over meatloaf. But as I lay there in the darkness, something else stirred beneath the hurt. A cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. They wanted to play games with their father's future. Perhaps it was time they learned who Douglas Cook was. I closed my eyes and began to plan. Sleep did not come. My mind replayed every sacrifice. Double shifts at the factory when Christopher needed books for school. Weekend jobs for his college bills. Eating canned soup while my paycheck went toward his education. I'd covered the difference for his wedding without a word. Throughout it all, I'd lived modestly, not from poverty, but from choice. Let them think I struggled while my investments grew quietly. Better to be seen as generous than wealthy. 25 years ago, when Leonard Whitmore's startup was just a dream, I believed in him. $500,000 of investment disguised as a loan. Whitmore Industries now employs 3,000 people. Christopher worked for a company his father had helped build, never knowing his paychecks were partially funded by the man he now called deadweight. All right, Christopher, this game can be played by two sides. Tomorrow I will surprise them all by agreeing to work. Let them feel superior while I position myself exactly where I needed to be. Sometimes the best revenge required patience, and I'd spent 65 years learning to wait for the right moment. The clock read 1:23 a.m. In 6 hours, I would begin teaching my son the difference between charity and vulnerability. He wanted to see his father humbled. He'd get his wish, right up until the moment he realized who was holding the cards. Morning coffee was already brewing when I entered the kitchen. Christopher stood by the counter in his weekend clothes, while Lily buttered toast. Both looked up as I appeared, their expressions mixing curiosity with residual hostility. Christopher, I've been thinking about your words, I said. You're right. The coffee mug froze halfway to Christopher's lips. Lily's knife stopped mid-spread. Seriously? Christopher set down his mug with suspicion. You're not going to fight us on this. What would be the point? I kept my voice steady. A man my age should contribute. Lily exchanged glances with Christopher, probably wondering if this was a trick. They prepared for battle and found surrender instead. Since you're being practical, Christopher said, I might have a solution. There's a janitor position open at my company. Whitmore Industries. I suppress a smile. That sounds perfect. I accept. Just like that. Lily's voice carried disbelief. Honest work is honest work. I replied. When would I start? Monday morning, 7 a.m. sharp. You'll be ideal. Follows orders. Grateful for the opportunity. Christopher paused, savoring his next words. The pay is minimum wage. Of course. Beggars can't be choosers, right? I nodded seriously. I'll need to speak with my boss, Leonard, about approving the hire, Christopher said, but I'm sure he'll understand. Leonard, my oldest friend, is my business partner. That's very kind of you, I said. Lily reached across the table and patted my hand condescendingly. See, this wasn't so difficult. I appreciate you both, I said. It'll be good to contribute. Christopher nodded. Maybe this will work out after all. He pulled out his phone. I'll make the call this afternoon. Perfect, I replied, already picturing my first day back at Whitmore Industries. The conversation moved on, but I barely listened. My mind was already planning Monday morning. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear. The week had passed in a blur of Christopher's smug preparations. He'd informed Leonard about solving his father's problem, purchased cleaning supplies, and outlined my duties with satisfaction. I'd played along perfectly. At 7:30 a.m., I sat in my kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the paper. The cleaning supplies Christopher had bought remained untouched. My phone erupted at 8:15. Dad, where are you? Christopher's voice crackled with fury. Leonard was waiting for the new janitor. Nobody showed up. Oh my, I said. What time was I supposed to be there? 8 o'clock. We discussed this every day this week. How could you forget? I paused, letting his agitation build. I'm so sorry, Christopher. Age. Sometimes things just slip away. This isn't about your brain. His voice rose. I vouch for you. I told Leonard you'd be reliable. Now I look like a fool. Perfect. Douglas Cook sat back in his chair, his face the picture of calm as Christopher's outburst echoed through the room. The storm of emotions that whirled through his son's voice was a symphony to Douglas's ears. This was phase 2 in full bloom. Everything was unfolding with precision. Lily, still trembling from the shock of her exposure, glanced helplessly between father and son. The walls that once echoed with their dismissive laughter now reverberated with panic and crumbling facades. Christopher's tirade continued, but Douglas remained a fortress of serenity, knowing that every syllable of blame only buried his son deeper into a pit of his own making. The time had come for Douglas to escalate his strategy. Monday would be a day Christopher and Lily would never forget. They had underestimated the man who had quietly built their world from the ground up, but Douglas Cook was done being their foundation. It was time to be their reckoning. Morning came too soon for Christopher, but Douglas had slept peacefully, knowing this would be the final act of his carefully orchestrated play. Dressed methodically in the work clothes his son had bought him, Douglas wore each piece like a costume for performance of a lifetime. Christopher, already in the kitchen gulping coffee with grim determination, bore the marks of a sleepless night. Dark circles, unshaven stubble, and a clenched jaw. Ready? Christopher asked curtly, skipping pleasantries. Ready, Douglas replied, pulling on the janitor's jacket. The drive to Whitmore Industries passed in tense silence. Portland's morning traffic gave Christopher something to focus his nervous energy on. Douglas sat quietly, counting down the minutes. Let me make something crystal clear. Christopher finally spoke, his voice tight. Today, there will be no confusion, no excuses. You will show up, you will work, and you will make me look competent. I understand completely, Douglas responded, tone submissive but laced with hidden confidence. Do you? Christopher shot him a glance. Because yesterday nearly cost me my job. Leonard's been asking pointed questions about my judgment. I had to beg him to give you another chance. Poor Leonard, Douglas thought. trying to reconcile why his business partner's son was pushing his father into menial labor. "Don't worry, son," Douglas said. "Today, everything will be different." The Whitmore Industries building loomed into view, a sleek structure of glass and steel. "There it is," Christopher announced proudly. 3,000 employees, multi-million-dollar operation. This is what success looks like. Indeed, Douglas mused. Success built on a foundation Christopher had never known he owned. Inside, Christopher handed Douglas a mop and bucket from the janitorial supply closet. "Make it look authentic," he said with a smug grin. They proceeded down the bustling corridor. Employees too absorbed in their morning routines to notice the elderly man trailing behind a tense middle manager. Douglas quietly observed, taking mental notes of familiar faces who, like Christopher, had no idea of his true influence within these walls. Leonard Whitmore was somewhere in this building, likely already aware of the unfolding charade. But today was not for confrontation. Today was for setting traps. "You'll start with the executive floor," Christopher said. "It's high visibility. Mess up and it'll be noticed." "Understood," Douglas replied. Douglas maneuvered his mop with slow precision, deliberately working near glass-walled conference rooms where company strategists held meetings. He overheard them discussing quarterly earnings expansion plans and rising concerns over a pending audit of the finance department. His lips curled slightly. The audit was no coincidence. Henderson and Associates had launched their internal investigation, and the ripples were already reaching Whitmore Industries. In the afternoon, Douglas found himself in the break room, deliberately timing his presence when mid-level managers gathered. They spoke of layoffs, restructuring, and whispered about a confidential report that had landed on Leonard Whitmore's desk. A report implicating discrepancies tied to the cook name. Lily's embezzlement had set off alarms larger than she ever anticipated. Christopher, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, was basking in what he perceived as control. He didn't notice how the tone in emails shifted, how meetings he once attended were rescheduled without him, or how Leonard's assistant took particular notice of Douglas every time they crossed paths. By late afternoon, Leonard sent a company-wide memo about a mandatory all-staff meeting the following week regarding operational integrity. Christopher scoffed when he read it. Douglas, however, knew the walls were closing in. When their shift ended, Christopher approached Douglas with a smug grin. "You managed not to embarrass me today. Maybe you're learning." Douglas simply nodded, his mind already on the next phase. That evening, back at home, Douglas noticed Lily avoiding his gaze. Her phone calls were hushed, frantic. He could see the cracks forming. Christopher's arrogance blinded him. But Lily was beginning to sense that the life they'd carefully constructed was teetering on the edge. Douglas spent that night refining his strategy. Phase 3 wasn't about confrontation. It was about isolation. By the end of the week, Christopher and Lily would find themselves standing alone, surrounded by a company and community that no longer trusted them. The next morning, Douglas deliberately left early, arriving at Whitmore Industries before Christopher. He made his way to Leonard's office, where the old friend greeted him with a knowing smile. "They still don't know?" Leonard asked. "Not yet," Douglas replied, "but they will soon. I need one more favor." Douglas explained his plan to Leonard. It wasn't about public humiliation. It was about teaching Christopher and Lily the slow, inevitable consequences of underestimating people. Leonard agreed. By the time Christopher arrived, Douglas was already stationed on the executive floor, discreetly observing as Leonard summoned his son into a meeting. The meeting was a pretext, a subtle interrogation about Christopher's recent decisions, financial authorizations tied to Lily's department, and his unusual insistence on hiring his father. Christopher stumbled through his answers, unaware that every word further implicated him. Throughout the week, Douglas maintained his janitorial role, strategically placing himself in conversations, quietly gathering information while Leonard and the audit team worked behind closed doors. The noose tightened as whispers of embezzlement reached more ears. Christopher's frustration grew. He blamed Douglas for his tense meetings, for the stairs and hallways, for Leonard's sudden coldness. At home, arguments with Lily became routine, each accusing the other of causing their unraveling. One evening, Douglas overheard Lily's frantic call to an attorney. She spoke of possible charges, frozen assets, and the likelihood of her accounts being audited. The fear in her voice was palpable. Christopher, meanwhile, received an ominous email from Human Resources about a formal review of his managerial decisions. His confidence cracked. Douglas watched silently as the seeds he planted sprouted into chaos. But the final act was yet to come. He needed them to reach the point of absolute desperation. Only then would the truth be revealed. As the week drew to a close, a company-wide email announced a surprise town hall meeting. Douglas knew this was it. Leonard had orchestrated the perfect setting. Christopher, pale and disheveled, approached Douglas that morning. "You'll stay out of sight today," he ordered. "This meeting's critical. Leonard's furious about something, and I don't need you making it worse." Douglas simply smiled. "Of course, son. I wouldn't want to cause you any trouble." Christopher never saw the gleam of satisfaction in his father's eyes. Douglas Cook's revenge was far from over. The next phase would shatter the illusions of control, exposing truths that Christopher and Lily could never bury. The game was still in play, and Douglas held every card. Douglas Cook's day had come. Whitmore Industries' gleaming atrium was packed wall to wall with employees. The tension was sharp, cutting to the murmurs and whispered speculations as people filed into the town hall meeting. The mandatory attendance, the vague subject line of Leonard Whitmore's email about operational integrity, had sparked a storm of rumors. Everyone knew something was about to explode. Only Douglas knew how precisely orchestrated this explosion was. He stood silently at the back of the crowd, still wearing the janitor's uniform his son had proudly forced upon him. But now it served as armor. The same mop handle Christopher had once seen as a symbol of humiliation was now his father's scepter of control. Leonard Whitmore took the stage, his presence alone silencing the entire hall. His usual charm was replaced with an icy resolve. Beside him stood the head of internal audit, along with Michael Richardson, the forensic accountant who had meticulously assembled the evidence Douglas had handed him weeks ago. Christopher sat in the front row, his leg bouncing nervously. Lily wasn't with him. She had called in sick, but Douglas knew it wasn't illness that kept her home. It was fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Leonard began, his voice reverberating through the atrium. "For over 2 decades, Whitmore Industries has stood on the foundation of trust, integrity, and family. But recent events have forced us to confront a betrayal that strikes at the heart of our company values." The room was silent, except for the occasional shifting of uneasy feet. Leonard continued. "An extensive internal audit has uncovered a sustained embezzlement operation within our finance department. Falsified expense reports, vendor fraud, and internal collusion have resulted in significant financial loss." Christopher's face drained of color. "We have irrefutable evidence," Leonard said, holding up a thick dossier. "And while the individual directly responsible will be held legally accountable, we must also examine the chain of oversight failures that allowed this theft to go unnoticed for so long." Leonard's eyes locked onto Christopher. The entire room followed his gaze. Whispers turned into stares. Christopher Cook, Leonard's voice was no longer that of a mentor. It was that of a judge. "Would you care to explain why you authorized expense reports tied to these fraudulent accounts?" The world seemed to tilt as Christopher stumbled to his feet. I wasn't aware of any discrepancies. My wife handled those reports. I trusted her." "That's precisely the problem," Leonard interrupted, his tone unforgiving. You overstep professional boundaries by intertwining personal interests with corporate oversight. Nepotism clouded your judgment, and now the company pays the price. Douglas watched his son flail, each word from Leonard striking with the precision of a scalpel. The humiliation Christopher had inflicted upon his father was now magnified tenfold. But Douglas wasn't done. Leonard paused, scanning the audience. In light of this, there will be significant restructuring within the management team. Starting immediately, those responsible will face termination and legal action. Christopher's knees buckled, but before he could collapse into his chair, Leonard raised a hand. However, before we proceed, I'd like to introduce someone. A man who represents the values this company was built. A man whose contributions, though unseen by many of you, are the very reason Whitmore Industries stands today. Douglas Cook stepped forward. A ripple went through the crowd as employees turned to see the janitor they'd overlooked now walking toward the stage with the poise of a man who owned the floor. Christopher's mouth opened, but no sound came. His eyes were wide, frantic, pleading for an explanation that wouldn't come. Douglas Cook, Leonard announced, our original silent investor, mentor, and the reason Whitmore Industries survived its first decade. Many of you know his name from old company records, but few knew that he remained involved, quietly ensuring this company stayed true to its founding principles. The revelation detonated in the room like a bomb. Gasps filled the air. Douglas stood beside Leonard, meeting Christopher's shattered gaze with serene authority. For years, Douglas began, his voice calm yet thunderous, I chose to remain in the background, believing that family and loyalty were best served quietly. But recent events have reminded me that silence can be mistaken for weakness. He turned toward Christopher, his tone sharpening. My son thought he could dictate my worth, diminish my contributions, and reduce his father to an expense. Today, he learns that foundations are not built on arrogance, but on respect. Christopher visibly trembled, sweat beading on his forehead. The room's energy shifted entirely. Effective immediately, Leonard continued. Christopher Cook is suspended pending further investigation. All managerial responsibilities will be reassigned. Security personnel approached. Christopher, now reduced to a hollow shell the proud man he was days ago, offered no resistance as they gently but firmly escorted him from a hall. Douglas didn't gloat. Revenge wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth restoring balance. The meeting concluded with Leonard thanking Douglas for his lifetime of dedication and announcing the formation of a new integrity committee, chaired by none other than Douglas himself. When Douglas returned home that evening, Lily was sitting on the couch, her face swollen from crying. The house, once filled with condescension and dismissive laughter, now echoed with the deafening silence of their downfall. She looked up, pleading, Douglas, please, I didn't know it would come to this. Douglas sat opposite her, his voice steady. You never thought it would come to anything. That was your mistake. The town hall meeting commenced in the grand atrium of Whitmore Industries, a sprawling glass-enclosed space designed for monumental announcements. Employees filed in, buzzing with anticipation and anxiety. The air crackled with rumors of a major shakeup. Douglas stood unobtrusively near the back, a mop in hand, blending into shadows while his eyes missed nothing. Leonard Whitmore took the stage, his face solemn, his tone grave. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering on such short notice. Today's meeting addresses an issue that strikes at the very heart of Whitmore Industries' integrity. A hush fell over the crowd. Over the past few weeks, our internal audit has uncovered systematic financial misconduct involving falsified expense reports, unauthorized vendor contracts, and abuse of managerial power. The names tied to these infractions will be made public as we proceed with legal and organizational actions. Douglas watched as Christopher stiffened, his face draining of color. Lily, who had taken a seat toward the side, seemed to shrink into her chair. Leonard continued. This investigation began with anonymous evidence sent to our partners, sparking a broader inquiry that has revealed a troubling network of deception. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Leonard raised his hand, silencing them. Effective immediately, we will be suspending certain managerial staff pending further investigation. Christopher's breathing grew shallow. He glanced around, feeling eyes turned toward him, whispers intensifying. Douglas's heart pounded with controlled satisfaction. The trap had been set, the bait taken. Leonard's next words sliced through the tension. Additionally, those found responsible for compromising the company's financial transparency will face criminal charges. Lily's hands trembled as she clutched her handbag. Her meticulously curated facade was disintegrating. The aftermath of the town hall meeting settled over Whitmore Industries like a suffocating fog. The once bustling offices felt muted, conversations hushed, and glances exchanged with suspicion. The air, thick with tension, carried the weight of scandal and imminent fallout. Douglas Cook, unnoticed in his janitor's attire, glided through the corridors with the grace of a conductor orchestrating his symphony's final movement. Christopher's suspension was swift and clinical. By mid-morning, an official email announced his administrative leave pending a thorough review of his managerial conduct. The same message subtly highlighted a connection to the ongoing financial misconduct investigation. Christopher's office was cleared out by noon, his nameplate removed as quietly as his credibility had vanished. In the HR office, Christopher sat slumped in a chair, a shell of the man who once strutted through Whitmore's halls. Leonard Whitmore entered, not with anger, but with a solemn disappointment. "Christopher," he began, "this didn't have to be your story. You wrote it with arrogance and blind ambition." Christopher opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, but no words came. There was no defense. Meanwhile, Lily's reckoning was far more public. A pair of auditors, accompanied by security, approached her workstation with a quiet request for a private conversation. Within minutes, Lily was escorted to a conference room where law enforcement officers awaited. Her arrest was dignified, but irreversible. Employees pretended to work, but every pair of eyes followed the procession. Douglas, observing from a nearby corridor, felt no joy in the moment, only a quiet affirmation. Betrayal wasn't just punished. It was dissected, exposed, and remembered. By evening, Christopher returned home to find Douglas seated calmly in the living room, sipping tea as if nothing had transpired. The silence between them was deafening. "She's gone," Christopher said, collapsing onto the couch. "They took her." Douglas set down his cup. "Actions have consequences, son." "This is your fault," Christopher snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, Christopher," Douglas replied, his tone firm yet devoid of malice. "This is your education. You thought power was inherited, but it's earned. You thought control was given, but it's maintained. And most of all, you believe that underestimating others was a sign of strength. It's not. It's a flaw." Christopher buried his face in his hands. "What now?" "I've lost everything." Douglas stood, his presence towering despite his age. "You've lost nothing that wasn't built on lies. Now you get to rebuild, brick by brick. Maybe this time you'll understand the value of a solid foundation." The following day, Douglas received a formal invitation to return to Whitmore Industries, not as a janitor, but as a strategic advisor. Leonard had made it clear the company needed his wisdom now more than ever. Douglas accepted, but not for the title or the office. He received to ensure that legacies were built on integrity, not deception. As he stepped into his new office, a panoramic view of the city before him. Douglas Cook allowed himself a rare smile. The game was over. The lesson had been delivered. But most importantly, respect had been reclaimed. Douglas Cook's revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. The restoration of dignity, of truth, and of the quiet power that comes from being underestimated one time too many.